Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's Information Studies 753, Preserving Information Media lecture. This will be our introduction to preservation. So we'll go ahead and get started. So here are the weekly topics that we will be looking at today. So what is preservation? What activities are part of preserving information? And how are digital and analog preservation similar, and how do they differ? Okay, so we'll start by looking at a pretty simplified timeline of a record. I'm sure you can find some more theoretical or conceptual timelines of a record or life cycles of a record out there. For instance, the record continuum model. But we're gonna keep things pretty simple, at least to start off with. So you have the stage where a record is created, the record is used, and then the record is either destroyed or it is stored because it has some kind of ongoing use to the organization or person that created it, or perhaps there are some kind of laws that dictate that the record needs to be stored for a particular amount of time. And oftentimes this storage length will be determined by a record schedule, and especially in the case of a corporation or an organization. I don't know that there are a lot of individuals that have record retention schedules. That'd be pretty impressive if they do. But yeah, and we'll talk more about storage in just a little bit. Okay, and so after a certain amount of time, the records may be appraised by archives, and the archive may decide to destroy the records. They may decide that we don't want to bring these into our repository, so we are going to destroy them. The records may be offered back to the donor or the creator of the records, and they may destroy them or keep them. But again, we're going to keep things kind of simple here. Okay, and then once the record has been appraised, it's brought into the archive. Various actions are performed on the record. The record is then stored, and the record is accessible into the indefinite future. And at least ideally, these stages here, the archival stages of this life cycle, are going to be supported and dictated, at least to a certain extent, by preservation policies and plans. And we'll talk more about those later on in this course. So different documents or policies that may say, you know, if a record is in this format, we're not going to bring it into our repository because we just can't take care of it. Or if a record is particularly damaged, we're not going to take it because we just can't do anything with it. Policies that will dictate how the records are stored, any preservation actions that are done to the record, you know, if copies are made of the records and so on. And again, we'll talk about all this later on in the course. So let's just go through these stages kind of one by one. So we have our first stage here where the record is created. So records are created by a particular person or by a particular technology. So it may be created by a particular piece of software. It may be created by some kind of process that encodes images onto film, and is created in a particular format. So it may be in a particular type of film. The software may create records in a particular format. And so, you know, this can differ from record to record. And the record, when it's created, contains particular content. So the informational content of the record, the image, the text in a document, the sound recording, and other types of content that a record can contain. And so records are created for a particular purpose, so to serve a particular need for the person that created them. It could be an administrative need, it could just be created as a hobby, but there is some kind of purpose or need that results in records being created. So at this stage, when the record is created, it's the most authentic version of the record because it is in the original format. It has content that hasn't changed over time for a variety of reasons. Ideally, there is the most information attached to the record or available for the record to tell people why the record was created and what it was used for. So this is really the sort of the defining authentic moment of a record. Okay, and then we have our next stage, the use stage. So the record is used by a particular person or by people. It's used in a particular way and for a particular purpose. And what's helpful for archivists and researchers to know long-term is what these uses were for and who used records. And that just provides additional information that archives can pass on to researchers, which can help researchers put into context the record or records that they're looking at. Okay, so next we have the stage where the record is stored. Records can be stored for a varying length of time. It may just be for a few days, it may be for months, it may be for years, it may be for decades. And as records are being stored, they may be cared for, or they may just be put in a room, they may be put in grandma's basement and just kind of ignored. And it's inevitable that records are going to change over time. So even in the best conditions, records decay. Paper may become more brittle. Images on a photograph might start to fade. Digital files may decay due to the nature of the storage that they're contained in. And so this change is inevitable. And as a result of this inevitable change, the content and context of a record may be lost. As an image changes, as it fades, that's going to result in a loss of content. As a record is stored for a long period of time, the information about who created it, who used it, what it was used for, and all the rich contextual knowledge that researchers want, that may be lost, especially if the person who created the records hasn't taken steps to make sure that that information is attached to the record in some form, via metadata or some other information contained within the record. And it's also important to note that when a record is in storage, it still may be used. It still may be looked at and consulted with periodically by the person that created the record or by people who have some use for that record into the future. So this is more of an inactive stage, but it's still possible that the record may be interacted with by the people that created it or used it. Okay, so assuming that the record is donated or made available to archives at some point, the record may be appraised by archivists. So this is our first archival stage in our simplified timeline or life cycle of a record. So records or archivists may consider the content and context of the record. When appraising it, they may use those different things to evaluate whether or not the record is valuable enough to be brought into the repository. And again, if the content and context has changed or been lost due to inadequate storage, then that may result in archives passing on records, even if the records might at one point have been quite important. So again, this idea that the records may have changed over time, and that may impact the content and context that was once a part of or attached to the record. It's important to note that appraisal may be impacted by the nature of the record. So if a record is in a format that is difficult for archivists to access, say it's in an obscure type of film or on an obscure type of film, say the information is on a file format that is difficult for archives to access, then that can make appraisal more difficult, and it might result in archivists saying, okay, well, this may well be important, but we're really unable to access this information in an affordable and sustainable way. So, we're gonna pass on this collection or the part of the collection that is contained in these particular formats that are problematic. This appraisal stage by archivists can really benefit from a relationship between the archives and the person that created the record, or I guess you could add in a person that used the record. This can help archives understand the content of the record, and if the content of the record is important, if it is relevant to an important function that the organization or the person that created and used the record carried out. And it can also help them understand the context. It can help them understand the who, what, where, when, and why of the record. And again, these can be important considerations that archivists can make when determining whether or not to bring a set of records into the repository. So the closer the relationship between the archivist and the donor or creator or user of the record is, the more able archivists will be able to understand this content and contextual information and make a informed decision about the overall value of the record, and thus its worth as a long-term part of an archive. Okay, so next we have a stage where the record is archived. So it's been deemed worthy of archival custody, and the archive have brought it into the repository. And this is where archivists will do things like processing, so describing the content and context of the record, making the records more accessible so that researchers are able to use and understand them. And it's important to note that preservation actions may occur at this point. So this may be the point where there might be some conservation work done to records. It may just be that an archivist has gone through and taken out the dreaded paper clips or staples that are in paper documents frequently. It may be that archivists have separated particular items that are deemed to be preservation risks and place them in storage that is more appropriate for the record. It may be that the archive has migrated records to a more accessible format. There are a whole lot of different types of preservation actions that can occur during this stage and can continue to occur throughout the life of the record. Okay, so next we have the stage where the archive is in archival storage. So into the indefinite future, when an archive brings a record or a set of records into the repository, there's kind of this tacit understanding that the records will be preserved for as long as the archive exists. And this is something that we'll talk a little bit later on in this course. So records can be in storage for, decades and decades and decades, ideally. And of course, this can result in changes to the record as well. Even in the most climate-controlled environments, records are still going to change. Ideally, archivists are able to slow these changes down, but you can't stop the wheels of time, right? So there are going to be some changes that occur. And there may be the loss of the records as well. So if records aren't stored properly, then the content or the context of the records may be lost. There may be some kind of fire, heaven forbid, that can destroy the records. The records may be in a climate that results in them decaying rapidly, and content and context of the records can be lost in that way. The records may reside on a server that is destroyed or has some kind of malfunction that results in the records being lost. So there is danger to the record throughout this storage stage, and it's important for archivists to be aware of those dangers and think of ways to limit those dangers and help ensure that records do survive into the indefinite future. And so, of course, during this storage stage, records may be used or not. Of course, not every record in an archive is used. Records may be on a shelf or on a server for decades and decades and not be used. Obviously, that's not really the ideal. As archivists, we want people to use our records, but sometimes that happens. But the records still need to be stored and preserved and taken care of nonetheless. Okay, and then finally, we have our stage where the records are accessed. So it's important to note that most likely the records that researchers access are not going to be as authentic as the original due to changes that can occur to the records due to storage, due to preservation actions that archivists have taken. There may be some changes to the content and context of the records that result in a loss of authenticity. Ideally, this loss of authenticity isn't too severe. Ideally, changes to the significant features or characteristics of the records aren't too meaningful that the record ceases to be authentic entirely, but it's very likely that there are going to be some changes down the line, especially if records have been around for decades and decades, especially if records were created on formats that it's difficult for archivists to provide access to. So the records have been copied to a different type of film, or the film has been digitized, or the records have been migrated to a different file format. All these things can have impacts on the authenticity of the record, as I have noted here. So both actions and inaction can impact authenticity over time. So when the record is accessed, it's important for the content and the context to be accessible. It's important for researchers not only to know what the content of the record is, but also to know how the record was created, why it was created, who used it, and also how the record has changed over time. So if the record has been migrated to a different format, if it has been copied onto a different type of film and so on, it's important that researchers have that contextual understanding and an awareness that what they're looking at is not the record in its most authentic or original form, and here are the actions that this record has undergone. And so, of course, it's also important to note that ideally records are accessible into the indefinite future. So unless records are deaccessioned or records are destroyed for some reason, there's this idea that records are going to remain accessible until, cockroaches rule the world. So again, these are just some general stages in a simplified lifetime of the record. Obviously, some of these overlap, so storage and access are going to overlap. Before the record is brought into an archive, use and storage may overlap, as I noted. There may be a situation where archivists appraise records before they are donated to an archive. But I just kind of wanted to start with a sort of a simplified view of this timeline. And we'll touch on all these things that I've talked about in the timeline and in these different stages as we progress through the semester. So again, this is just an introduction or an overview of preservation, and we'll elaborate on, I think, all of these topics and subtopics as we move forward. So according to the Harvey and Mahard article for this week, there are some overarching principles of preservation that are true for both digital and analog types of preservation. So preservation that focuses on preserving electronic records, and preservation that focuses on preserving things like audiovisual records, paper records, photographs. I guess that's audiovisual, but non-electronic records, we'll say. It's kind of generalized here. So Harvey and Mahard article that these principles apply to both of the sort of subsets of preservation. And this is something that we will discuss later on in the semester. In one of your papers, you'll be working with these principles. So I won't belabor the point too much, but they would argue that throughout this whole timeline that I looked at, collaboration is necessary to ensure preservation. So just to take one example of a general principle, so this could be collaboration between the archive and the creator or donor of the record. So again, this idea of having a collaborative relationship so that the archivist can ensure that the content and context of a record is preserved and is available for researchers in the future. This idea that taking preservation action now is better than doing nothing kind of relates to what I just talked about. If you are in an archive that has records that have been on have been in some form of storage, even for a long time, it's never too late. The worst thing that you can do is just do nothing. If you take the initial steps, again, even if records have been in your archive forever and they haven't been preserved very well, that's still better than just kind of throwing up your hands and saying, oh, well, there's nothing to be done. You can always hope to save some of the content or context of the record and make it as valuable for researchers as possible. Another one that I'll touch on is prefer preservation actions that address large quantities of materials over actions that focus on individual objects. So this is related to sustainability, which is an important consideration with all types of preservation. Ideally, your preservation solutions are ones that you can do to an entire hard drive of records, and not something that you have to go through and do record by record by record, because there could be thousands of records. So in order for preservation to be sustainable, archivists really need to consider these sort of big picture preservation actions or preservation activities, and try not to get too much into boutique-y types of individual object-related preservation. So, things like replacing paper clips, taking out staples, doing conservation work like rebinding books, and so on. Some of these specific principles are interesting to look at as well. So do the minimum necessary to stabilize and preserve the object. So again, this goes back to the ideas of sustainability. Preservation action should not harm the object. Hopefully that's pretty obvious and pretty straightforward. Preservation action should be documented so that archivists can make researchers aware of how the records have changed over time. So again, Harvey and Mahard would argue that all these principles apply throughout this whole simplified timeline that I just shared, and for both analog and digital preservation. And again, we'll kind of look at these and touch on these throughout this semester. Oh, this last one is also interesting too. Preservation action should adhere to ethical considerations, and that's something that we'll also talk about in this course. However, it's important to note that there are differences between digital preservation and analog preservation, even though some of the specific and general principles that Harvey and Mahard list may apply to both types of preservation. Because of the differences between digital and analog preservation, they are sort of enacted or interpreted in different ways. And this is something that the authors discuss in their article. So for instance, there might be, or there are different preservation actions taken for digital records than there are for analog records. So, you're unlikely to, you can't really emulate a piece of paper, right? It's just a paper. It's just a piece of paper. There's not really a need to try and recreate the conditions that the paper lived in or that the paper was sort of created and used in. It's something that it just doesn't make sense. Looking at the durability of records, typically analog records are much more durable than digital or electronic records, which can be changed very easily. Really, anytime you open or access an electronic record, that changes it. Whereas you can take a piece of paper and crumple it up and smooth it out, and there might be some creases in it, but you can still interact with the content in a way that is fairly fairly similar to how the records were interacted with when they were originally created. So record formats, obviously analog records consist of records that are in formats like paper or different types of film or photographs, different types of images. Whereas with digital preservation, you're dealing with formats like PDF, TIFF, JPEG, and so on. So there are just different formats that differ between the two types of preservation. Typically speaking, analog records are in formats that are more accessible for people to look at. Anyone can pick up a piece of paper and read it, assuming that they're literate. Assuming that people have vision, they're able to pick up a photograph and look at it. Whereas formats in some formats that digital records may be on may be very inaccessible because the software that is used to access records on a particular format may not exist, or it may be very difficult to come by. It may take levels of expertise to provide records or to provide access to records on certain digital formats. So At least typically speaking, analog records are on formats that are much more accessible. As I mentioned, uh, there are types of film that it may be difficult to project or make accessible these days if you don't have like a 8mm film projector. Things like nitrate film can be difficult to access simply because of their combustible nature. But for the most part, analog records are more accessible than digital ones. Another interesting one is the amount of contextual information possibly available. I would argue that with electronic records or digital records, it's possible for more contextual information to be attached to the record than in the case of analog records. If an electronic record or digital record has good metadata, that can really tell you a lot about the record and why it was created and what it was used for. And you may not have that with uh, a video or a piece of paper, right? You don't have the ability to find out as much information about an individual record as you might with a digital record. Again, assuming that a sufficient amount of metadata was created and attached to the record over time. Another area in which analog and digital preservation is dissimilar or are dissimilar is the resources required. You can put a box of papers in a room that is reasonably well climate controlled and not have to worry about it for a long amount of time. Assuming that it's not getting dripped on or eaten by rats or whatever, it's going to survive for the near future. And it doesn't really take a lot of expertise or a lot of skill to provide access to those records. You can just say, okay, go down and get that box, and we'll be able to share it with the researcher. There's typically less expertise involved in providing access to analog records and preserving analog records than with digital records, which may take knowledge of different types of file formats, different types of software, different tools that archivists use to preserve and provide access to records. And so there are just different types of expertise that go into preserving these types of records. And because digital records can be so frail, archivists need to intervene and take actions to preserve electronic records more frequently than they do with analog records, again, sort of typically speaking. So the amount of interventions is more than with analog records. Even if you're just doing a fixity check to make sure that electronic records aren't changing or decaying, that's still an intervention, that's still resources that you have to put towards preserving records, whereas that's not as much of an issue with analog records. And again, we'll touch on all these things throughout this semester. Okay, so what's common is, at the end of the day, the preservation of both analog and digital records involves the preservation of the context of the record and the content. So to go back to this idea of significant properties or significant characteristics, these, generally speaking, are the significant properties or characteristics of a record. So again, the informational content of the record and the context of the record, the who, what, where, when, and why. And so preservation aspires in both analog and digital preservation to preserve both of these. It's not just the content that needs to be preserved, but also the context surrounding the record's creation and use. If a researcher is looking at a photograph, but they have no idea why the photograph was created or what it was used for, that really undermines the usefulness of the record. And essentially, okay, it's not going to make the record useless, but it's really going to detract from the value of the record. And so preservation that seeks to provide meaningful access to electronic records in the future, I feel that meaningful access involves preserving as much as possible of the context and making that available to researchers as well. So sort of on a very broad level, that's something that is common between digital and analog preservation. And this really forms the basis of preservation. And what we talk about in this course will be steps that archivists can take to preserve this context and content both so that it is available for researchers into the indefinite future. So that's a very broad picture or definition of preservation, and we'll kind of add on to and build onto it throughout the semester, but just to kind of get us started with a baseline description of what preservation is, here you go. Okay. So last but not least, there are some interesting questions that are kind of on the periphery of preservation, or I guess maybe even a main part of preservation. So does preservation include advocating for public record laws to make sure that organizations are required to keep information for a certain amount of time so that information may one day be accessible for the public to understand society and to understand the actions that an organization or a person took? Is that a part of preservation? Is a part of preservation transparency about archival decisions? So transparency about the preservation actions that archivists have taken, why they made those decisions, how those decisions impacted the record, and so on. Is that transparency a part of preservation? Excuse me. Is a part of preservation working with underrepresented groups to ensure that the records survive into the future? Working in different neighborhoods or with different communities to encourage people to take care of their records at home, encouraging people to value their records and realize the worth that the records have as sources of memory and sources of collective identity for a particular community. Is that a part of preservation? Does preservation include outreach to the public? Is that something that archivists should really consider a part of preserving this content and context into the indefinite future? So I would encourage you to think about these questions and think about how these different questions relate to the timeline that we looked at during this lecture, how these questions relate to even the individual stages within that timeline, how these questions relate to, again, this idea of preserving both the content and context of the record into the near future. And we'll touch on these questions as we move through the semester as well. Okay, so that's it for this week. Again, I just wanted to start with some basic ideas of what preservation is, some goals of preservation, some of the different activities that may be included in preservation, some of the differences between digital and analog preservation, and also adding in some thoughts and ideas and questions that may be perceived as being kind of on the edge or periphery of preservation, but may be important issues for archivists to consider when thinking about preserving the content and context of records and making that information available for future researchers. So yeah, please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you for listening. I'm really excited to teach this course and elaborate on some of the things that we talked about today, elaborate on all the things that we talked about today as we move through this semester. And I hope that you are as excited as I am. So again, thanks for listening and take care, and I will talk to you soon.